Okay, so we could just dive into the Bitcoin side now.
Oh boy. Okay.
And so maybe the best place to start is, why do you think Bitcoin is important to the people who might not be in Bitcoin yet, or might not know much about it yet?
Yeah.
Like if you were to
Yeah.
talk with one of them and try and say, hey, look, I know that this might not be your cup of tea. You might not be super
Right.
involved in it, but why? But this is why you might want to pay attention, or this is what you might
Yeah.
want to think about when you hear Bitcoin.
Yeah. And well, I'll use this as an opportunity to transition from what we were previously speaking about, because I am a non-technical founder in the Bitcoin space, right? And so I have a different perspective on why I entered in this space. And I definitely did not enter in because I was excited to read about the Bitcoin white paper and all of the various lines of code that have contributed to this project. That wasn't my initial draw. I've become more interested in that as I've gotten in the industry, but came here for a totally different reason. And initially I came here, kind of dating back to the journey into Frontier. Initially I came here because I just have a strong passion for helping build platforms to help other people launch off of, right? So my journey with Beats for Better that I was sharing earlier was ultimately to build a platform for young artists, creatives, et cetera, to be able to facilitate their creativeness and launch real businesses. And it was all about platform development for them. And what I think the most important thing when it comes to something like Bitcoin that's so beyond the tactical components of how Bitcoin is introduced is that we live in a world where not everyone has access to this great financial ecosystem that the U.S. and its residents get to participate in. Even though our system is broken, we have a place that for the most part we can feel comfortable storing our funds. And even though money is not everything, money at the end of the day is ultimately what society has created as its key, really, for achieving your dreams. It's very, very difficult to achieve everything you want in this life without having some sort of financial stability, and in many cases, some form of financial success. And so for the dreamers out there who are like, I want to do it not because of the money, I want to do it just because I love the thing that I'm doing and I'm really passionate about this North Star, remember that that although money is not everything, it's certainly something. And as my grandmother's always said, money's not everything, but it's certainly nice to have, right? And so because of that, we have to look at money a little bit more strategically as dreamers that are maybe listening to this podcast today, as looking at it as a really important key to our future. And so again, that gets back to how do we, if we know that money is an important part, it's not everything, but it's part of what we're trying to do, then we have to look at who is the stewards of our capital. Right. And that gets back to the dangers of the centralized system that we operate in, where we've seen that the stewards of our capital, the people that are holding our money, whether it be investors, banks, et cetera, maybe can't always be trusted. Right. Or maybe it's just the government that can't be trusted. And so if it's our money, but we're putting it in the hands of other people, and those other people we're not 100% confident in, then we need to recontrol our funds. And so now the question you ask yourself, and the question that Satoshi asked himself over a decade ago, is how do we solve that problem? Right? We know that finances are the means to our dreams. We know that they're in the hands of people that we don't necessarily trust. We might trust them. Some of us fully trust them, but I know a lot of people don't, right? Particularly young people that are rising in our world and seeing some of the economic challenges we're facing. And the best answer that we've seen to that question so far is Bitcoin, right? We've tried to solve this problem before, but ultimately Bitcoin seems to be the best answer that we have so far. And so when I think about why Bitcoin matters, it matters for a lot of reasons. It matters for the reasons I just described, that we want to take control, again, of our life. And to take control of our life, we have to take control of the means to our dreams. In this case, finances are a part of that. So by controlling our finances, we control more of our life, and therefore can get closer to achieving our dreams. You can see how Bitcoin naturally fits into our day-to-day and why it's important. The second thing is that this goes back to something we shared earlier in the podcast that I was mentioning, which is everyone else's dreams, right? So we have our own dreams that we want to achieve through all the methodologies we've spoken about in this call, the power of entrepreneurship, being able to have security and confidence in how we control our finances. But the second question is, how do we achieve everyone else's dreams, and why are those important, right? And everyone else's dreams, unfortunately, are not all afforded with the same level of opportunity and support that you and I see, Will, right? There's people, again, in places all around the world who don't even have the ability to even consider their dreams because they're so focused on just making sure the food's on the table, right? And a big problem with a lot of those people, and the reason that they're not able to achieve the success that we're able to, is because they're not able to tap into any financial systems that exist, right? A lot of success is built in the world, not just by making money, but by multiplying money. But if you don't even have the ability to access a bank account, how will you ever multiply your money?
Well said. Yeah, Bitcoin, it's pretty incredible when you look at it from not just like the Western point of view, which, I mean, you mentioned this. It's crazy that, there are so many places around the world where people just don't even have access to the basic financial systems that you and I or any of the listeners on this podcast have. I mean, we take banks for granted a lot of the times, because if you look at, let's say that you're living in, let's say that you were living in Ukraine, for example, when you were trying to leave the country, Bitcoin was saving lives there. Let's say that you're crossing over a border, you don't have documentation, you're not going to be able to open a bank account. You're not going to be able to take out a loan or do any of these things that allow us to go and actually build a company and go and interact with the world in a more efficient way. And at the end of the day, money is a game of trust, right? If you believe in the currency, that's what gives it value. When you see these countries going through hyperinflation, say you were in Venezuela and you were a very wealthy family and you had generational wealth, you saw that wiped out in a matter of months. Everything that your father's father, your father, and your entire family has worked for, gone like that. And there was nothing that you could really do. There were people that went and protected themselves in Bitcoin, because for the first time ever, we've created a form of money that is not controlled by a single government, organization, person. And that's pretty revolutionary. It's the first time that you have money that's backed by real world energy. It's wild to see how many people over the past few years have suddenly realized what they thought that they owned, what you thought that you had complete control over, might not necessarily be yours. And it didn't matter if you were, someone who didn't have a dollar to your name versus a Russian oligarch. Anyone can seize your assets. And we've even seen it with countries. Like we've seen us taking away money from like countries that thought that they had foreign reserves in dollars with the US, just having that wiped away. And so I think that at the end of the day, what the message I'll leave people with on the Bitcoin side, if they haven't really looked into it that much, is Bitcoin is the only true asset that you can 100% own, where you don't need to rely on a separate counterparty or third party. No bank can take away your Bitcoin, no government, no whoever. If you have the private key to your Bitcoin wallet, that is your Bitcoin and you can access it from everywhere. And so maybe I should have made that a little bit more clear earlier when we were talking about the people in Ukraine. If you were living in Ukraine and you were trying to go to the bank and you were trying to take out your money, it's like you see that you have $100,000 in your bank, you're trying to withdraw it. Well, it's very, very upsetting to realize that that is not your money, and you might not be able to get out of the country. You might not have access to any capital, and that can mean, the difference between being able to buy food, being able to buy shelter, being able to buy your way out of a country that is in the middle of a war. And so,
it's the difference between life and death ultimately, right?
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is it's never a problem until it is, And so
exactly
with Bitcoin, it's always nice to be able to say, look, you can protect generational wealth much more easily. And it sounds crazy to talk about this stuff right now because this is just so detached from all of our everyday lives. But at the end of the day, at least just understanding that there are some of these dynamics at play, it might make sense to have a little bit of Bitcoin in a Bitcoin wallet that you control, just as a safety precaution.
I totally agree with you. And you use the example of Ukraine, which I'm sure many listeners can say, well, Will, that's an extreme example of a country that's in a war-torn scenario. But let's use an example of that looks totally different than that. Like you take Canada, which is generally a peaceful country, generally a happy country. They had riots a couple of years ago where truckers were going on strike because they felt like they were underpaid. And the government said, we're going to disable your access to your personal funds if you continue on this strike. And they did. And there were truckers that went to their bank account and they tried to withdraw funds from their ATM, and the government said, no, you can't touch it. So nothing is in your control when it's not in your pocket.
100%. Well said. I'm really glad you brought up the trucker situation in Canada, because 100%. It's one of those things that it's always, someone else until it is you. So last question that I wanted to ask you on Bitcoin, and this one, it's a price action question, but you don't have to answer it in a price action way. So the question is, the question is your price prediction for Bitcoin, or if you don't want to give a price prediction for Bitcoin, you could give a really long-term price prediction. Just give it whatever time period you want. I'm someone where I believe it's very difficult to make a short-term time prediction, but I can make longer-term predictions just seeing, okay, this is where the puck's going. The one other piece as well that I wanted to, before you answer that, is to ask you, for everyone listening, if they want to follow what you're doing, support what it is that you're working on with Frontier, or anything else that you just want to share at this point in time, where can they stay connected with you?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. They're two great questions. Well, I mean, I think we really hit the point home in the importance of becoming decentralized from centralized institutions and the power in Bitcoin doing that. And ultimately, it all, in the case of Bitcoin, you can tie a quantitative value to the amount of decentralized activity that's occurring, because typically the higher the price of Bitcoin, the more people that are participating in the network, the more people participating in the network, the more people getting into a decentralized space, and the safer that our world ultimately becomes. The sky is the limit for Bitcoin ultimately. One of the most unique aspects of Bitcoin, and is ultimately the driver behind price, unlike many assets like the US dollar, the more people that participate in the US dollar, it doesn't necessarily mean the dollar's value is going to increase, because there's not a limited number of supply of dollars that are out there. Whereas on the other hand, Bitcoin is sort of interesting. The reason we see a direct uptick in the price of Bitcoin when more people participate in the network is because there's only a limited amount of Bitcoin that will ever exist, 21 million to be exact. In 2140, the last Bitcoin will ever be mined, meaning that we'll have a legitimate, fully capped currency at that point. But even within the next 12 months or 13 months from now, we'll be entering into the halving, and the number of Bitcoin that will be released into circulation every day will be cut into half. So when I think about where Bitcoin goes, anything that is supply capped is theoretically going to have no ceiling to what its price value could become, right? A price value of Bitcoin is going to be dependent upon, of course, number of people that participate in it, amount of Bitcoin that can be, the how we value Bitcoin in terms of its value against a currency, and if currencies, the one problem with valuing Bitcoin against in comparison to a fiat currency is that fiat currencies don't have really any true value to them, so it's difficult to price Bitcoin in terms of dollars. Especially, again, when we look at dollars specifically being a currency that's just continuing to become devalued over time. So I always have a hard time pricing it in terms of dollars. But in terms of what the value of Bitcoin will be in dollars, at least for the short term, because again, I have a hard time with long-term price predictions because of the devaluing of the US dollar. To give a shorter term prediction of what I think that will mean, I don't necessarily think that Bitcoin in 2023 is going to be a $60,000 asset again. I think the primary reason why is that there's just greater macro uncertainty, and Bitcoin is still not a complete inflation hedge. Bitcoin does still trade like a risk asset, typically trades with stocks like what you're going to see in technology. And during uncertain financial times, people are not typically going for high risk asset. And so I think we have short-term volatility, no question, because of macro market conditions, because of the large amounts of institutional capital that's in the Bitcoin space. Long-term value, I think, is going to be more closely correlated with, again, the supply cap of Bitcoin, the long-term value of being a decentralized currency. And my last note is where we go with price. Yeah, I mean, the only data point that I'd tack onto price right now is that we know that Bitcoin traditionally has a 6 to 7x increase post halvings, right? We have a halving that was in 2020 that led to the $60,000 price point for Bitcoin in 2021. We'll probably see something similar 2024 to 2025, I would suspect, with an April 2024 halving. So what does that mean? Again, I'm not good at price predictions, but if I was to guess, I would say Bitcoin probably hovers between 20 to 40K leading up into the halving. Bitcoin post-halving, I think it could be a six-figure asset post-halving, but that's about as specific as I'll get.
That's a really good framework, I think, to think through things. And also for everyone listening who doesn't know how the mining cycle works, when he's talking about halving, that's dealing with the distribution of Bitcoin to the Bitcoin miners. And that the reason why that matters is because that's affecting the supply side of Bitcoin.
Inflation is transitory.